Every racing driver has their own best year. Schumacher's 2002, Hamilton's 2017, Verstappen's 2023, years that cemented them as not just great drivers, but all-time great drivers. And yet, nobody from any era or any motorsport had, or probably ever will have, a greater year than Jim Clark's exploits in 1965. Jim Clark, was born to a farming family in Scotland in 1936. After schooling and the war, he began tackling road rallies and hill climbs in his Sunbeam Talbot. Turns out he was pretty good at it, and in 2 years, he went from private entries in his daily driver to racing Jaguar D-types in national competition. He won a lot of races, but his most important race, he finished second to Colin Chapman at Brands Hatch. Chapman, nonetheless, was so impressed that he gave him a Lotus drive for the 24 Hours of Le Mans, which ultimately resulted in a podium finish. Chapman was once again impressed, and he gave him a Formula Junior seat for 1960. Until John Surtees decided to tackle the Isles of Man TT instead of the Dutch Grand Prix that year. Colin thought that Jim would be a good substitute for the future world champion, and that is how Jim Clark went from racing in Formula Junior to Formula One in less than a year. He retired in mechanical failure, but he scored his first points just 2 weeks later in Spa. By 1961, he was getting podiums. By 1962, he was getting wins. And by 1963, he was the Formula One world champion. That is an incredible progression from Formula Junior racing in 1960 to points, then podiums, then wins, then championships, one after the other. 1964 was looking to be a repeat of this success, until multiple retirements at the end of the season dropped him down to third in the standings. So he had to settle with winning the British Saloon Car Championship that year. And for the year after, 1965, he didn't slow down. In fact, he decided to enter 6 different motorsport championships around the world. Formula 1, British Formula 2, French Formula 2, the Tasman Series in Australia, the British Saloon Car Championship, and the Indy 500. So let's see how he did. And since there are so many races across so many series, across so many countries, we're going to discuss each one separately, so we don't jump around too much. And let's start off in America with the greatest spectacle in motor racing, the Indy 500. Now, a casual fan who's not quite as familiar with Clark may be surprised to know that he already had an IndyCar win under his belt at the 1963 Milwaukee 200, and in fact, he came tantalizingly close to winning that same year's Indy 500 with the Lotus 29. It was only a controversial decision not to black flag the leader that prevented Clark from winning. So with the newly built Lotus 38, nobody stood a chance. In the race and qualifying, AJ Foyt somehow managed to qualify ahead of Clark, but that was the closest Foyt ever got. Clark led 190 out of the 200 laps to become the first foreigner to win the 500 in half a century. It was also the first win for a mid-engine car, and the first time that Indy averaged over 150 miles an hour throughout the race. Clark and the Lotus 38 quite literally ended the antiquated superiority complex of the front-engine roadsters, and by the end of the decade, they were all but gone. This, in fact, might be his most important win of the entire video, just because of how significant it was to IndyCar as a sport. It was equivalent to the Cooper team winning the Formula One World Championship in 1959. That is how much of a game changer it was. But his Indy win came at a price. He missed several European rounds, including the first 2 races of British Saloon Car Championship, where he was driving a Lotus Cortina Mark I. By the time he scored 6 points in round 3, he was over a win behind Frank Gardner's Cortina. But then he won at the Goodwood circuit with Gardner stuck in 3rd. Great progress if he wants to claw back that deficit. It would be a shame if he had to miss a round to compete in Formula 1. Oh, yep. He had Formula 1 duties and missed round 5, which allowed Jack Sears to catch up in the championship, somehow having a worse start than Clark, who missed several races. But it meant that at the end of the day, these 3 drivers were only 10 points apart at the halfway point of the season. And then Clark won again at the Crystal Palace, and he would have won again at Brands Hatch if it wasn't for Sears crashing into him touring car style and spinning him off the track. He was later disqualified for getting outside assistance in restarting, and ultimately Sears won the championship in the final round by 4 points over Gardner. Clark finished 3rd overall, just 8 points behind, despite the disqualification and not showing up for 3 races. In my humble opinion, that's more impressive than Sears' championship, but hey, props to him for, competing in the whole season and not missing 4 rounds, essentially. But let's get away from saloon cars and back to open wheelers for the rest of this video, but instead of being in America, we're going to the other side of the planet, in Australia, with their national Tasman Series, which was very popular at the time, despite, today nobody knowing it even existed. Now, he was driving a specially built for the series Lotus 32B, and initially, he didn't score any points in round 1, so he was in dead last. But then he took victory in the next 4 races in a row to absolutely crush Bruce McLaren by nearly double his points total in 2nd place. Easy, done, next championship, please. And that was Formula 2, specifically the Trophees de France and the British Formula 2 title. Now, both of these, he used a Lotus 35 to hop back and forth across the English Channel. Now, the French Formula 2 series was just 4 races long. The marshals must have been on strike or something. Either way, Clark actually had some competition in this one. It was rare for 1965, but he did have some competition in the form of Jochen Rindt, the future posthumous 1970 F1 World Champion. And, you know what? They duked it out in the first 2 races. Clark finished 1st, then 3rd, while Rindt finished 3rd, and then 1st, meaning that they were tied on points at 13 apiece. Until Rindt retired from race 3 and Clark won the last 2 rounds of the season to take another championship by nearly double the points of his nearest competitor. Britain, meanwhile, was not so simple. He actually had to fight the Brown team of Graham Hill and Denny Hulme across 5 Formula 2 races. Now, Denny got a good start in his Brown, winning race 1 as both Hill and Clark retired. Not a great start from Clark, having to come from the back of the championship to fight at the front. Luckily, they had some help because after winning race 1, Denny was punished by not scoring any points in the next 2 races. In those 2 races, Hill won race 2 and finished runner-up behind Clark in race 3, ensuring that he took the lead of the championship. Until Clark won again, and Hill only mustered 3 points in the second-to-last round of the season, and they headed into the final round in basically a 3-way heat where any one of them could win the championship. And amusingly, it was a round that was won by none of them. In fact, Denny got 6 points by finishing 2nd, Hill got 4 points by finishing 3rd, and Clark got just 1 single point by finishing 6th. However, that sole point was enough to take the crown, scoring 23 points to Hill's 22 and Denny's 21. Whew. As a Clark fan, cutting a little close there, not gonna lie. After the utter domination of the Tasman Series and in France, you would have thought it would have been a little more comfortable, but really cutting it down to the line, winning by a single point in the final round. But Graham Hill had one last shot to beat Clark. Formula 1. See, Hill was at BRM and they actually had a pretty good car in 1965, while Lotus was using the 33, essentially just an evolved version of their 1963 championship winning 25. That is a 3-year-old car by that point, but Jim Clark didn't seem to care very much and proceeded to get a grand slam to start out the season, leading from pole to victory and getting fast lap of the race just for good measure. Hill got third in that race and was in a pretty good spot to take the lead of the championship. Because of the Indy 500, we're going full circle, baby. Clark had to miss the Monaco Grand Prix to compete in Indianapolis. And sure enough, Hill capitalized brilliantly to win Monaco, and with it, take the lead of the Formula One World Championship. Clark decided to actually compete in the rest of the season, and decided he needed to make up for his little indiscretion of missing a race to win one of the most important races in the world. And he proceeded to destroy Formula One, winning the next 4 races in a row, while Hill only got on the podium once. That meant that Clark went from 2nd place in the World Championship to being able to mathematically clinch the title with 3 rounds to spare in Germany. But here's the thing. That race is on the fearsome Nürburgring, the most dangerous track on the calendar, and a track that Clark had never won on. Despite these obstacles, Clark took his 3rd Grand Slam in the 1965 season, and with it, the Formula One World Drivers' Championship. Good timing, too, since he failed to score a point for the rest of the season because of mechanical failures. He helped wrap up the Constructors' title for Lotus as well that same year. Unfortunately, that would be Clark's last ever Formula One championship. The Lotus 43 couldn't match the brilliance of its predecessors. Sure, it had a wild H16 engine that made 400 horsepower at over 10,000 RPM, but it only finished 1 race in 1966, and the 1966 US Grand Prix proved to be Clark's and the H16's only win that year. For 1967, the brand new, game-changing Cosworth DFV debuted in the rebranded Lotus 49. The greatest racing engine of all time got Clark 4 wins, but troubleshooting it retired the Scott 5 times in an 11-race season, making him finish 3rd in the title, just 10 points behind the championship leader of Denny Hamlin. A year later, he was dead in a Formula 2 race at the Hockenheimring. He was just 32 years old and had only finished 34 Grand Prix before his death. Excluding his incredibly high mechanical failure rates, Clark won 74% of all races that he finished. In my opinion, 1965 saw him reach heights that we will never see again from a racing driver. Across 4 continents and 5 racing series, Jim entered 32 races and won 20 of them. He finished on the podium in an astonishing 75% of them. And this isn't a case where he had one really dominant car. This was done in Indy cars, Junior Series, touring cars, and F1 cars. Vastly different machines that handle in vastly different ways on oval tracks, tight, technical touring car tracks, and the wide open ovals of Monza. He got 4 championship titles in 1 year and a 3rd overall in touring cars, while also winning the greatest spectacle in motor racing. That's a monumental achievement. In fact, he remains the only person to ever win the F1 World Championship and the Indy 500 in the same year. Clark proved that he could drive everything that year, and when he died due to a blown tire, the entire racing world stopped. If it could happen to him, it could happen to anybody, and Jackie Stewart doubled down on his safety campaign that would eventually save hundreds of lives. Unfortunately, Jim Clark could not be one of them, and his tombstone reads, "Farmer, and world champion.